Please stand for the national anthem. You may be seated. Chairman Hayden Alexander and other members of the IMA's Board of Governors, Dr. Hamid Khan, Director, and other members of the IMA's management and staff, Mr. Kishan Kumarsingh, our distinguished lecturer today, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I am Alicia Carter-Fisher, and it is truly my pleasure to welcome all of you to the second of our public lecture series on this very special day, World Oceans Day 2018. This year, the theme for World Oceans Day is centered around the prevention of plastic pollution and the maintenance of healthy oceans. And so today, as we pause to reflect on the myriad of ways the ocean contributes to our well-being, from the supply of nourishment to the cooling of the Earth's surface in the regulation of our climate, the provision of medicines, oxygen, and much more, we pause to recommit, or perhaps for some of us to commit for the first time, to adopting lifestyle changes that will support the preservation of our marine environment, our marine biodiversity and their habitats, and the ingenious, or I should say indigenous, traditional cultures that live in serene harmony with our marine environment. As we reflect on the ocean's bounty, it is also critical for us to consider some of the emerging threats to the ocean's health, and by extension, our own health and well-being. Today, our distinguished lecture examines the ocean and climate change and its impact on small island states. But you may ask yourself, what do these themes, both themes, the theme for World Environment Day and the theme that we have chosen, how do they relate? One word: human activity. Human activity is responsible for the growing problems we have with plastic pollution and the health of our marine biodiversity. And human activity is also responsible for the emerging challenges being experienced as a result of climate change. Climate change impacts sea level rise, our freshwater supplies, our agricultural pursuits, our marine-dependent economic activities, and coastal development initiatives. More importantly, perhaps, it impacts the efficiency with which the ocean can deliver some of those wonderful life-sustaining gifts I mentioned earlier. So I assure you, you are in the right place and at the right time, as our distinguished lecturer will not only define the problem, but let us know what steps we can take to adjust and tailor our activities to save this blue marble we call our home. After the presentations, we will take questions. So without further ado, I again welcome all of you, and ask Dr. Hamid Khan, our director, to introduce our distinguished lecturer for today, Mr. Kishan Kumarsingh. Dr. Khan.
Thank you, Madam Chair of the proceedings this afternoon. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Mr. Hayden Alexander, Chairman of the Board of Governors of the Institute of Marine Affairs, my other colleagues from the IMA, you excuse me, but there's a light and I can't really see who you are or where you are. I also want to acknowledge a few friends from the years gone by who have journeyed all the way from the Southland to be with us this afternoon. There are a couple of the old IMA faces that I see in the audience as well, and I'd like to welcome you all here today. Let me, first of all, provide you with some synopsis and background to our public lecture series. The IMA this year, 2018, is celebrating 40 years of excellence. Excellence in research and service to the government and people of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. And for that, the IMA is extremely proud. In my case, I have had the privilege to represent the Institute of Marine Affairs at many of these events over the last 3 months as the director of the IMA. And yes, it's only been 3 months since I've been in this position. But there's a little history to me as well. And that is that when I first started my career as a marine scientist, I started at the Institute of Marine Affairs way back in the 1980s. So a lot of the history of the IMA in those days is part of my history and how we all end up where we are in time. This week in particular has been one of those weeks where we are particularly proud to be part of the Sustainable Development Movement here in Trinidad and Tobago, because we have been joining with many entities like the Ministry of Planning and Development and the International Coral Reef Initiative to celebrate not just today, which is World Oceans Day, but World Environment Day and International Year of the Reef. World Environment Day, as you know, is one of the major signature events in the global calendar. And in this year in particular, it marked the occasion for us to look at plastics in a comprehensive way and look at its impacts and develop an awareness and a strategy for how we manage plastics. As you may be aware, the theme for this year's World Environment Day celebrations or observance is actually Beat Plastic Pollution. And you would have seen on the television the ticker tape that runs across TV6 during the news time, that same hashtag, Beat Plastic Pollution. And what they try to do is engender a sense of awareness for everyone to move away from the use of single-use plastics, which are styrofoam, PET bottles, plastics, and things like that, towards more conscious decisions in terms of choosing more sustainable products like veggieware, for instance. But today is not about plastics. Today is about oceans and the effect of climate change on those systems. And Mrs. Carter, oh right, is back. And it therefore gives me the opportunity to introduce a very good friend of mine who, incidentally, we both started out our careers together at the Institute of Marine Affairs. In those days, Mr. Kumarsingh was the nutrient chemist of the IMA. And then while I sullied myself doing all sorts of mundane and unimportant things, Mr. Kumarsingh moved on into a very global and global recognized career. Mr. Kumarsingh is the lead technical negotiator on international climate change negotiations, not just for Trinidad and Tobago, but for the entire Caribbean region. He's been the co-chair of the Durban Platform, is that what you call it, for quite some time, and serves for almost 20 years now as Trinidad and Tobago's contributor to the UNFCCC negotiations. Indeed, if it were not for people like Mr. Kumarsingh, the Paris Agreement may never have happened. And Trinidad and Tobago has to be extremely proud of the contributions of people like Mr. Kumarsingh, and certainly from the perspective of the IMA and its distinguished alumni, we are indeed very proud of the achievements that you made. I don't want to dwell too much on Mr. Kumarsingh. I know he has the gift of the gab and can do more justice to what Trinidad and Tobago has been able to influence at the climate negotiations level. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce to the podium Mr. Kishan Kumarsingh. He is the head of the Multilateral Environmental Agreements Unit of the Ministry of Planning and Development. And I'd like to invite you to make your presentation on climates and oceans and the climate change scenario.
Thank you very much, Ahmed, and for a very generous introduction, I must say, and a humbling one. Thank you for that. I understand that I have about 40 or 45 minutes to speak on this issue. And as most people who have heard me speak or know who I am, I could speak on this thing for days on end. So it will be quite a challenge to squeeze all of this in 45 minutes, but I'll try my best, and of course bearing in mind that I have to keep the technical terms at a very, very, very minimum. So I thought that in structuring this lecture, it might be useful, first of all, to reflect on what caused this problem in the first place, and then go more into the subject matter as advertised. And of course, the issue that the world, I guess, is grappling with is the issue of climate change and its adverse impacts, and its particularly detrimental implications for small island developing states. So, as you would know, I'll take you back to 1870 or the mid-1800s when there was no technology and the Industrial Revolution had started. And then man had to find some, when they decided to discover machines, they had to find some form of energy to drive these machines and develop them further. And that was found in, of course, fossil fuels, which was then available, including coal, oil. I don't know if gas was then fully developed, but certainly coal and oil. And coal and oil are fossil fuels. They are hydrocarbons. And I think I'm causing this. So let me just get rid of it. That's the end of my two leashes. And coal and oil and gas, being what they are, fossil fuels are hydrocarbons, and hydrocarbons are made of two elements, basically hydrogen and carbon. And when you burn these substances, a lot of energy is given off. But in addition to the energy that is given off and is used for driving machines and driving economies, because energy drives economies, one of the byproducts is carbon dioxide, which in and of itself is not a bad gas, contrary to popular opinion. It's something that is found in the atmosphere naturally because it is given off by plants. We breathe it out when we exhale. And therefore, greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, like methane, like nitrous oxide, which is also formed when you burn fossil fuels, are naturally occurring. And what they do is they have a heat trapping ability. So during the day when the earth heats up, it cools at night. That is why we feel cooler in the night and we feel hot in the day. What happens is that these gases in the atmosphere trap the heat as it is radiated out of the earth, as it escapes. And that causes the earth to be maintained at a temperature that, if it were not for these greenhouse gases, would be very, very cold, and in fact life on earth would not be possible. So because of this greenhouse effect, because of these gases, earth is kept at a temperature that is conducive to life as we know it. And the climate has changed for millions of years, many, many times, naturally. So what is the problem now, if this is a natural occurrence? Well, the problem now is because of the enhanced emissions of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere as a result of primarily burning fossil fuels to drive energy demands that will in turn drive economies. What has happened is that there has been a build-up in the concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. You have more greenhouse gases, they trap more heat. Invariably, the temperature goes up. And we've seen that. There's evidence that the Earth's atmosphere has warmed over time. And this graphic shows basically, I'm very technologically handicapped, so I will take my chances on the pointer, which is the pointer. Anyway, I'll just walk across. I pointed the wrong, okay. Oh, look, here's tech support. All right, so press the red button and it comes on. So this is 800,000 years ago in time before present. And these estimates of carbon dioxide over time has been estimated from what are called ice cores, where you drill deep down into the poles and you get ice cores and you section them. And you are able to tell from the gases trapped in the ice core what the carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere would have been at that time. So here we see, and I pressed the wrong one again. So here we see that the carbon dioxide has fluctuated many, many times, and climate change has occurred many, many times over the past 800,000 years. But if you notice here, which is about present, you see what is happening. The carbon dioxide is almost linearly up. And it has been the highest in the last 800,000 years. So if you take a deep breath, everybody. How does it smell? Nice, yeah? You are the first humans, or among the first humans, to breathe in air that contains more than 400 parts per million volume by carbon dioxide. It has never been this high in the history of human existence. And again, the reason is because of the enhanced emissions due to man's activities. And it comes from not only fossil fuel burning, it comes from agriculture, from waste management. It's a whole plethora of activities that give rise to these industrial processes, nitric oxide production, and so on and so forth. The thing about climate change is that the atmosphere does not respond immediately to the emissions. So it takes about 5 or 6 decades, about 50 or 60 years, for the concentrations in the atmosphere to begin to affect the atmosphere in terms of climate. Now, the climate system dissipates the energy of the atmosphere. So if you have an increased heat content in the atmosphere, called global warming, then what happens is that the climate changes to accommodate that extra heat, and therefore you have climate change. So the climate change that we have been experiencing over the past couple of decades is as a result of emissions that took place many, many years ago. So that, for example, if the Earth were to shut down now, if I could snap my finger and the entire planet shuts down, and not a single molecule of carbon dioxide or nitrous oxide or any other greenhouse gas is ever emitted again, ever, we are still going to get changes in the climate in the next 5 or 6 decades because of the emissions that we have been putting in the atmosphere as of present day. So we are committed, we are obligated, we are doomed to have these changes in the climate in the future. And therefore, the temperature increases that will accompany that climate change are inevitable. The challenge now is how do we manage that climate change, and how do we manage the temperature increases. And that is where it's a global problem, because every country in the world, regardless of how minuscule their contributions are, including small island states like Trinidad and Tobago, and we are relatively high compared to other Caribbean islands. Although we account for about less than 1% of global average, global absolute emissions, every country has now recognized that they have a responsibility. It's a global problem, and if there's a global problem, then there should be, ostensibly, a global solution. And for many decades now, at least since the late 1970s, governments have been trying to grapple as to how they can agree to address this issue. That may sound very simple and could be a naive supposition if you think, well, if it's a problem, then there should be a solution. If it's a man-made problem, there should be a man-made solution. The issue is that that solution comes with a lot of other unscientific baggage and considerations. It includes socioeconomic development. It includes politics, because every country has an interest in development. No country wants to be left behind. Trade competitiveness and things like that. And of course, the issue of sovereignty, that no one wants to will surrender their sovereignty for the sake of another country. That's how the world works. That's the premise under which international law operates, the principle of sovereignty. Each country has equal say. So countries finally came together in 2015. Well, it was a process that started in 2000, well, it started a long time ago, but this last process started in 2011, called the Durban Platform for Enhanced Action, that required countries, where countries and governments agreed that they will now negotiate an instrument, a legal instrument, international legal instrument, where actions will be taken by all countries to address the problem. Fast forward to 2015, and Paris, everyone claps, and so on and so forth. And it's a very ambitious agreement. It provides for every country now to make a conscious and effort, a politically strong one, to address the issue of climate change. So that really, in a nutshell, is the problem and the solutions that countries are now aiming to find to not even, if not solve the problem, certainly to find solutions to contribute to solving the problem at some point in the future. So, how does the ocean come into all of this? You would know, for example, that the ocean covers more than 70% of the Earth's surface. So more than 70% of the Earth's surface is water, and the ocean itself has many functions, as we know. It provides transportation routes via shipping, so it facilitates trade and economic activity. It provides biodiversity services in terms of food, fisheries. It sustains societies, it sustains mankind as a source of food. But it also performs a very critical function in terms of regulating the climate, because more than about 98% of all the radiation that comes from the sun on Earth is absorbed in the ocean. So you would imagine that if it weren't for the oceans, the Earth would be a lot hotter. And how does it, we know that heat in the atmosphere is dissipated in the climate system. How does the ocean handle all of that 98% of radiation that comes from the sun? It does so through something called the ocean conveyor belt, and I think I have a graphic of it somewhere. Okay, this is it. So the poles are cooler than the equator, and the sun, the temperatures at the equator are higher. What happens at the poles is that the water gets cooler and it becomes denser and saltier, and it drops. And as it drops, it creates a gap, so warm water fills it. So you have this, it creates a current. And the current travels along the eastern seaboard of the US, comes down to the eastern part of South America. It picks up steam again, well, not steam, sorry, it gets colder as it approaches the Antarctic. It goes across, it splits into two, into the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. It travels north, it gets warmer, and returns back, and then the cycle is completed. And I think I have a, okay, there it is. So that's how it goes. So it distributes the heat in the ocean like that, and that is called the ocean conveyor belt, as it is commonly known. And it takes 1,000 years, it's been estimated. No one has measured this, of course, but it's been estimated that it takes 1,000 years for that complete cycle, for any body of water, or to complete that entire cycle. If you start at one point, it will take 1,000 years for that water to return to that point. Oops. Where did it go? I had a graphic showing how it actually is constructed. But anyway, you get the idea. Yeah, so we have this conveyor belt, and you have the exchanges in distribution of heat in the ocean system. But the ocean is in direct contact with the atmosphere, and so therefore you have heat exchanges between the Earth and the atmosphere, and that has maintained an equilibrium where you have that physical exchange of heat from the oceans into the Earth that has kept the temperature of the atmosphere fairly stable. With the heating of the atmosphere now, what we are seeing is that the ocean surface temperatures are also beginning to increase. And I think I have a graphic for that one. If it would change. Where do I have to point? Do I have to point here? Right. It's working now, right. Okay, so if we could start over. This is a time-lapse animation of the temperature, the global temperature from. Can we pull it back to the beginning? From 1800 to 20 something. 2012, I think it was. Anyway, the point is it's a 5-year time-lapse that shows how the changes in the Earth's atmosphere temperature has, or the global surface temperature has changed. And you can play it now, please. And you can see the yellow portions showing an increase in temperature. If you look at the scale, just here, this is 0, that's +2, this is -2. And if you look at the years, changing in the years and how the color changes, you'd see a dramatic change as it hits 2000. And that is up to 2014. So we have seen how the Earth's surface has changed over that period of time since 1840, was it 1840? Till 2014. And clearly, there has been and recorded an increase in the global temperature. And this has also caused an increase in the surface temperature of the oceans. Now, what does that mean? What are the implications of that? It means, therefore, that the ocean has perhaps reached or is reaching close to its heat-bearing capacity, and therefore changes in the actual temperature is now manifesting itself. It cannot hold the heat anymore, or is showing signs of not being able to do that. Now, part of the global circulation that I showed earlier part of the global circulation that I showed earlier is this red warm current that runs along the eastern seaboard, and that is part of the Gulf Stream, you may have heard, that goes straight across to Europe. And what it does, it actually tempers the northern hemisphere winters. The winters in Europe would have been a lot harsher, particularly in the UK, if it were not for this. Now, this Gulf Stream, or this ocean conveyor belt, because of the increased temperature, has shown to be slowed down by at least 15% since the mid-20th century. It means that this is a fear of scientists. So it has been demonstrated that this change in the conveyor belt has slowed down by 15%. That has implications. So we can see, for example, increasing temperatures at the sea surface in the tropics, where it's going to be more pronounced because that's where most of the radiation hit. Fish or species that could only tolerate a small range of temperature will now start to migrate. And we've started to see that. In fact, as far as Japan, they have recorded the parrotfish, which is now an invasive species because it is now decimating the kelp forests, the underground kelp forests, as far up north as Japan, and disrupting the ecosystem there. It means then that fish will likely to be migrating out of areas near the equator. And who's located near the equator? Us and small islands across the globe. That would imply, therefore, that fish stocks upon which people rely for food are likely to be beyond their reach of the fishermen who could now go out to catch them. They will have to extend their ranges. Of course, one man's loss is another man's gain. the countries of the north are probably may likely to benefit from these migrations. Again, coral reefs. We all know that the tropics and islands in the Caribbean, for example, have a lot of corals, and corals are nurseries for, well, I'm speaking to the converted, you know all of this IMA, but they are nurseries for species of fish that feed people, they're sources of food and recreation and so on. And corals can also and only exist between a small range of temperature. But corals also perform a very significant function, a biophysical function, more than an ecological function, and a fishery function, because it provides sand for beaches, and it also dampens wave energy, so that when waves come in, if you've been to Tobago, you notice that you can walk very, very far out, let's say if you go to Pigeon Point, where it's shallow, and because the waves don't come in. And the reason because the waves don't come in is because it is dampened. The wave is dampened by the corals. Now, if you have an increase in sea surface temperature, corals are likely not to survive. If they begin to die or bleach, and we've seen increased incidences of coral bleaching, one of the reasons being increased surface temperatures that have been observed over time. When they go, it means that the coastal areas of small islands are now exposed to wave energy. It means that waves can now come in further, it can wash away beaches, you have loss of sand, loss of amenities, loss of recreation amenities. Trinidad and Tobago is the second largest, and correct me if I'm wrong, the second largest nesting site for leatherbacks turtles, which is a globally important species, globally endangered, so it has a high biological diversity value. And if the beaches in Trinidad disappear, then species of global importance can be at risk. In small islands, depending on who you talk to, there's no coastal zone in a small island. The whole island could probably be considered as a coastal zone, because by the time if you start to walk in some islands from one end, you can reach the other in a matter of a small amount of time. In places like Tuvalu, for example, in the South Pacific, which is on a real threat, and the Marshall Islands, where you have spring tides, they're called king tides. These high tides actually wash over the entire island. So they come offshore on one side and they exit on the other side. So this poses a threat to communities that are located on small islands. For small islands, almost all economic activity takes place on the coast. You have transportation links, you have schools, you have housing, human settlements, you have economic activity. Just look outside, Point Lisas. This is not unique for Trinidad, because this is a characteristic of all small islands. So the general well-being of islands and islands' economies are located in the coastal zone. And therefore, if that is exposed, then a lot is at risk. In fact, it is becoming well established that climate change can pose an existential threat to small islands, meaning that they could actually disappear. In fact, about 8 to 10 islands of the Solomon Islands in the South Pacific have gone in the past 10 years. They've just disappeared, sunk, drowned, if you want. Some atolls in the Maldives have also suffered the same fate. So it is well established that climate change is an existential threat. Part of the consequence of heating of the ocean as well is because it can now provide that kind of heat fodder for storms and hurricanes. Because when storms pass over, if you look at, Sigoni and others, if you watch CNTD6, you would hear Sigoni talking about warm water and cold water, and it is no chance of development because it passes over cold water. The point is, warm water feeds these systems. And the warmer the water, the more intense these events are likely to be. And if you also look at last year, where we had a series of hurricanes passing, this is consistent with some of the climate projections, that warmer seas are going to feed extreme events, and extreme events are going to become more intense. We have seen some of that happening over the past few decades, and in fact, last year was one of the outstanding, or one of the years that stood out. So it also poses, and we have seen what happens to Dominica. We have seen what happened to Dominica. I have friends in Dominica, and they still do not have electricity in their houses, still today. My brother works in Barbuda, and he says that, you know, it's almost a psychological burden to be walking and working in ruins because nothing has been built back. All of these impact on GDP resources. All of these impact on economic well-being. So that's another part of how oceans can now can affect and be affected by climate change. So you have impacts on biodiversity, impacts on fisheries, and of course the secondary and the tertiary impacts on human beings, food, and so on and so forth. But another issue that compounds that is that when you have increased carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere, what happens when carbon dioxide dissolves in water? Forgive me for the chemistry, but carbon dioxide is a gas that when it dissolves in water, it becomes slightly acidic. Yeah? And coral reefs do not like acids because they can dissolve, because acids dissolve them. Now, over the past, we have actually observed a 0.11 units, pH units decrease in ocean acidity. And you might say, well, that is not much. But because, I don't want to get technical, but because pH, or the measure of acidity, is a function of the amount of acid in a technical relationship, the 0.11 always sounds small. The 0.11 units always sounds small, actually accounts for 29% increase in acidity, because it is a log relationship, but I'll leave it there. So increased acidification in the ocean will also have direct impacts on the viability of coral reefs. So they could directly bleach them, hamper their growth. And how do they hamper their growth? Is because corals are carbonate. They have carbonate in their skeletons. And when you increase the acidity, the ocean water makes that part of the chemistry, carbonates, less available. So corals cannot use the carbonate to build more corals. So their growth is hampered, and therefore they stand to be decimated or destroyed. So ocean acidity also has an impact on other species like conchs or shellfish that have shells that are made up of the same kind of material. And they build that material from the seawater, and if that component is not present as a result of increased acidity, then they're also at risk. Time flies. I could speak again for another 3 or 4 hours, but I wouldn't. So that is how the climate change is now going to be impacted on oceans, and how these impacts can now be especially dangerous for small island states. Now, when the temperature of the water increases, what happens? When you increase the temperature of more substances, they expand. And seawater is no different. Seawater expands, and that is what is manifested as sea level rise. So we have observed rises in sea level in Trinidad and Tobago and in the region. Now, all of these are not uniform throughout the world, so some places will have more this, can you play this animation shows how the sea level has risen over the Earth's surface. If you look at the scale here, you can see this is 0, this is a drop, and this is an increase. So if you look at the equator, you will see that sea level rise in the Pacific in particular is more pronounced than it is in other parts of the world. So it's not a uniform. Sea would not rise uniformly, and in some places it may actually drop. Yeah, and this is NASA, so therefore there's a focus on the United States. But you get the idea. So what happens? Sea will rise, but also coupled with increased temperature, you can see melting of the ice caps because ice melts in higher temperatures. Sea level rise is a result of thermal expansion due to heating, coupled or combined with melting of the ice caps. also act to raise the level of the seas higher. What was the result? You have increased inundation or increased encroachment on small island states. Small island states already have limited land masses, and therefore flooding would be an issue. If you have increased inundation from the ocean and you have increased rainfall intensity, which is also going to happen because of climate change, as we've seen here as well, there's evidence from the Met Services. Then you have water from here, you're going to sandwich communities. We've seen that. We know we're not strangers to flooding in this country at all, and particularly in this part of the capital. So and when these things happen, they have economical and socioeconomic impacts. You have loss in manpower. Anybody who has gotten trapped in Port of Spain when there's a slight drizzle understands how long it takes to get home, the traffic that it causes, the stress that it causes on human beings. You go home angry. So you understand all of the social, the psychological and impacts that environmental issues can now, be placed on societies. There's a projection that if the Greenland ice sheet, for example, that has been melting more than we thought it was, if the Greenland ice sheet actually melts, it can raise global sea level by 7 meters, that is 21 feet. If it melts completely. It wouldn't melt tomorrow, by the way, but it will melt in time to come, in some decades to come, unless something is being done to halt these changes. What can be done? Let me just quickly get to that rather than belabor the point on some of the impacts. But you get the idea of how important oceans are, how they regulate the climate, the impacts of climate change on the oceans, and what it can mean for small island states. So the bottom line is the small island states are at risk because of the inherent characteristics: small islands, small size, limited technological capacity, limited human capacity, and so on. All of these places small island states at a gross disadvantage. But what can we do? We know what the world is doing under the Paris Agreement. So the idea is to reduce emissions so that global warming can be restricted to about 2 degrees above pre-industrial times, that is before there was any emissions, with an effort to bring it down to 1.5. All of the actions that countries have pledged so far are woefully inadequate. All right? If these actions are designed or analyzed, then we are on track for a warming of between 3 and 4 degrees. But the Paris Agreement hopes that with time, governments will announce more ambitious action to continue reducing to a greater extent these emissions, because emissions equals climate change, degree of climate change, and therefore it has been estimated scientifically by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a group of scientists worldwide, that a warming of 1.5 is probably optimal for small island states. And there's a report coming out in October that has analyzed the implications of this increase. So what can we do in the meantime? That's what world governments are doing. So time will tell whether world governments will now step up to the plate and announce more ambitious actions. Trinidad and Tobago included will have to do that, because the Paris Agreement states that with each commitment, which would probably come after every 5 years, it's still being negotiated, that every 5 years governments will now have to indicate what they are going to do for the next 5 or 10 years in terms of ramping up their action to reduce emissions. And it provides that whatever you commit to must not be less than or equal to what you committed to before. So every cycle of commitment has to be more and more ambitious, because you have to close that gap. But what can we do? That's what world governments are doing, and whether Paris will succeed will be left to the jury in time to come. But that is the intergovernmental part. But what can we do as a nation, as an island, as a small island that is so vulnerable and so prone to the adverse impacts of climate change? One, of course, is as per the national climate change policy that we have articulated, and it is available. I should have asked Candice to work with copies, but it's available online. Just search it and it should come up. It seeks to build climate resilience. Now, how do you build climate resilience? It means that when you plan for impacts of climate change through your national development process. Now, in a small island, it's very difficult to ascertain what changes are actually due to climate change in terms of the physical impacts, because superimposed on that natural change is developmental changes. You're developing all the time. You're building a road here, you're building a road, you're building buildings here, you're clearing land here, you're doing this. It's all part of the development process. So therefore, it becomes difficult to search through all of that development signal to find what is actually being or could be attributed to climate change. That's one of the difficult challenges that is posed to science. But be that as it may, the approach is to build climate resilience. And how do you build climate resilience? Is that you maintain one way of doing it, and perhaps the most an important way in terms of the coastal resources and the coastal features that we have, is to maintain those natural features that have been given the function to protect from climate changes. So, for example, mangroves protect the shore. When the sea rises, mangroves migrate backwards. So it has an autonomous sort of change. Same with corals. When the sea rises, corals grow. They're not stifled, they actually grow. So because islands develop, it has been shown that islands actually develop in periods of high sea level. So maintaining ecological features to let them perform their ecological functions is one way. And how do you do that? Is through effective planning, recognizing the fact that coastal resources and their ecological functions have a value, and it's not a nuisance in the way of development, but it still has to be balanced because you live in an island that has to be developed. That is the challenge that small islands face. So it's not only a physical impact because of climate change, it's a development challenge of how you balance economic interests, development interests with what can be seen as inimical to your own survival. So for coastal resources, for example, minimizing land-based sources of pollution. You would want to maintain healthy ecosystems in the coast, such as coral reefs, for example. So any effluence that comes from land that could affect your coral reefs, including nutrients, for example. Nutrients come from fertilizers that you use for agriculture. It comes from leaky sewers. It comes from latrine pits that in places that are underdeveloped. It comes into the river. The river goes to the sea eventually. This causes a growth in, I was a nutrient chemist, it encourages growth of algae. It stifles the corals. Then you lose that natural barrier function. Same with mangroves. So minimizing pollution that could be detrimental to the coastal resources that offer this natural defense to the impacts of climate change is one way that human intervention can actually help to build resilience. Integrating these impacts into national development so that, for example, the climate projections have projected that there will be a decrease, and we have seen signs of that over time, a decrease in the cumulative amount of rainfall in Trinidad and Tobago. You've seen the messages have, data has shown, not very significant, but the trend is perhaps now emerging, and it's consistent with the climate models. That will have an impact on water resources, one, for potable water consumption, but it will also have an impact on water that is available for agricultural production. Because with increasing temperature, the soils for agriculture growth will become more arid, it will become drier, so it will require more water. So you're faced with less water, more water requirement, more water demand for potable consumption and so on. So how you then develop your resources and how you manage your resources in the light of climate change and the climate change impacts is critically important. And how you adapt to those projections is critically important, because if you adapt to the wrong thing and understanding what the impacts are and modeling those impacts from both an empirical perspective as well as using models, computer models, is critical. Because if you don't understand what you're dealing with, you're going to adapt to the wrong thing. So integrating climate change impacts in all sectors into the national development process is a critical part of building climate resilience. But those things are, of course, policy level things and across the board, but there are things that that are within immediate control, like I said, pollution control, for example, land-based source of pollution, protecting your fisheries, managing your fisheries, because these are the things that are going to be impacted on. We have been hearing of the advent of the blue economy. This is we've heard the green economy, the brown economy. We are hearing now the blue economy, which is maximizing the resources of the coastal area, and which is particularly relevant for small island states because they are surrounded by water. And for us in the Caribbean, because we have a huge sea for ourselves called the Caribbean Sea, and we have a small amount of islands. How do you now maximize the economy or the economic resources of the ocean and the nearshore ocean to build a new economic paradigm if that set of resources is now under threat itself from climate change? So you understand your diversification options could also be limited because of climate change. I am nearing like I said, I could speak for another 2 weeks, but I know you don't have the time. So I'll wrap up there. I think you get a general idea. I will just perhaps close. I just walked with this because I felt empty. Because I saw Ahmad have his thing and everybody with us. So let me not look out of place. Let me just close perhaps by saying that oceans are important. We recognize that as sources of food, sources of recreation, sources of trading routes, and everything else that can be used to maintain and sustain a human society. It plays an important part in climate regulation, but now that climate regulation is coming to a peak where the impacts of climate change is now affecting the oceans themselves, and by extension, those countries like small island states that depend heavily on coastal resources and coastal amenities, and as well those impacts on the coastal zone that will impact on socioeconomic activity. We can do our part. I think management of the environment as a whole, and this has nothing to do broadly with climate change per se, but managing the environment to ensure minimum pollution, minimum threats to those ecological resources that could provide the services that will build and maintain resilience to the climate change impacts are critically important for short-term actions, while the global efforts through the Paris Agreement and all of the other things are being pursued at the higher policy level. With that said, I think I have time for a few questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kumarsingh, for condensing a life's work into 45 minutes. We have a few minutes available for questions related to Mr. Kumarsingh's presentation. So I'd like to open the floor now for some of those questions. I'd ask that the questions be very succinct and to the point of his presentation. And I'd like to ask our Madam of Ceremonies to be the facilitator for the question and answer session. Thank you.
So there is a, there are microphones, not one, but there are microphones around. There's one to the back, and I acknowledge my friend with the head wrap.
Hello. Hi, good afternoon. My name is Letitia Parkinson. I have two very short questions. First one concerning our woefully inadequate contribution towards the Paris Agreement. Just wondering, what is the status in terms of what have we done, and is there any way for us to find out this information? And the second question I have is about, in terms of when Trinidad and Tobago signs on to any international agreements and we make commitments, right? Is there anything that citizens can do to ensure that we honor our commitments that we've made?
Take one question at a time or one set at a time? Yeah, okay, good. Thank you very much. Let me just correct myself if I did say it, but I can't remember saying that we had a woefully inadequate contribution. What I did say was if you add all of the contributions of all the countries in the world, they would be woefully inadequate. So there's no finger pointing to any one country. They're called nationally determined contributions, which is a bottom-up approach which countries have decided this is what they can do for the time being, but of course with some assistance technologically, financially, and so on, they can do more. It's called the NDC and it's available. If you just Google it and you look at Trinidad and Tobago's contribution, nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement, it will come up and you'll see what it is. And it's good that you know that because it leads directly to your second question in terms of what citizens can do to pressure governments, because that is who you have to pressure, the politicians, because these are political commitments. The commitment to reduce emissions under the NDC, under the Paris Agreement, is a political commitment. The one way you can do it is become aware and track what is happening, because we at the Ministry of Planning are now developing we have developed, and I understand it has been accepted and blessed by Cabinet, according to the Minister this morning, Minister of Public Utilities, that the nationally determined contribution implementation plan, we have an implementation plan to implement that NDC, is now approved, and we will now be rolling out that. We have developed in tandem with that, and to track the implementation, something called a measurement or monitoring, reporting and verification system, where emissions are going to be measured according to a fixed methodology, reported according to a fixed format, and verified by third parties to make sure that we are achieving what we said we want to achieve. So one way citizens can do it is become aware, go do some research. It's not always that ministries and public servants will feed that information to you on a timely basis, although we try, because we have something called a climate change focal point network, and you can register your name and email with Candice, and if you raise your hand, Candice, everybody will know who you are, and she will let you know everything that we are doing and where we are tracking and where we are at and so on and so forth, because the idea is to empower people to do precisely that, because governments are fickle by nature. We have seen what has happened with the US, for example, where President Trump has decided unilaterally that the US will pull out of the Paris Agreement. And that is just an example, because it happens all over the world. It happens with every government. And every citizen, regardless of which country you live in, the responsibility rests with you to do the research, to understand the impacts, to understand what is at stake for you as an individual, one, and also bring that pressure to be brought on those that make policy, because that is part of the environmental access to justice and participation that we have just actually agreed to in Costa Rica under Principle 10, and it's something that we could also research in terms of empowering the citizen to holding their governments to account in terms of what they say, because when they sign agreements and they negotiate agreements, they negotiate on your behalf, not on their own behalf. It's important to know that. Hope I answered the question.
Gentleman with the cap. Yeah.
Yes. Hi, Sochan Laltu. I am a lecturer at COSTAT and I teach Coastal Zone. I was particularly pleased with your presentation, sir. I just wanted to understand, in the CARICOM sub-region, we have a number of SIDS, and based on some of the evidence now, we are particularly vulnerable to most of the impacts of climate change. Collectively as a group, have we initiated programs to be able to look at joint vulnerability and mitigation, as well as a joint way forward in dealing with some of the multilateral agreements?
Yes, good question. And the short answer is yes. A good few years ago, in fact, there has been in existence something called the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, which you must have heard of, in Belize, and they coordinate and provide advice to Caribbean governments on climate change issues and vulnerability issues. And they have also been charged to seek funding on behalf of the region, mandated by heads of government, to develop programs, to institute programs with the participation of member states to look at climate vulnerability in all its forms. And there are quite a few that I will not go into, but if you Google it, it's all there. Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, Caribbean programs, there are many programs on fisheries, for example, fisheries vulnerability, addressing adaptation and climate change, looking at coastal resources. There are several countries that have been thoroughly assessed in terms of the vulnerability and actions proposed. So a lot is being done from a regional level through the Climate Change Center. And you can send this message to them because yeah, we are mandated to promote and to also support them in this collective effort. In terms of mitigation, I understand you mean mitigation by reducing emissions, or is it just mitigating climate change from managing it? Okay. Well, okay then. Yes, adaptation. So there are many programs and projects that have been coordinated by the 5Cs. We call it 5Cs because Caribbean Community Climate Change Center is just too long to pronounce. So the 5Cs have enacted and engaged regional governments, and we have participated in quite a few of them since 1998, as far as I could remember. So, yeah, answer is yes.
Mr. Abood.
Good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to have heard Mr. Kumarsingh's contribution and very proud of the representation you have served Trinidad and Tobago over these years. But as a senior member of the ministry, we share the concerns that you have expressed, but are confused by the ministry's posture. Our questions have to do with your status in the ministry, because the Ministry of Planning currently is in charge of the EMA and is influential in terms of our national posture, in terms of what we can do here. For instance, I have 4 questions that are shorter than my introduction. Presently, and still after 20 years of FFOS lobbying, there is no single incentive for the recycling sector. For the past 20 years, much longer than that, we have had the beverage containers bill. It has come to Parliament more than 10 times. The nation has spent tens of millions of taxpayers' dollars debating it, preparing it, amending it, and it is a critical legislation and intention of Parliament that continues to handicap what could be a very effective EMA and a very effective recycling, export, revenue generation, and employment of the voiceless and the privileged, and yet we have none. What is your ministry's position? How can we empower your ministry to move towards the legislation that has affected the world? Thirdly, many countries have already banned single-use plastics as a progressive way of finding alternatives. What is our country waiting on? And finally, although we appreciate the tremendous intellectual and devotional capacity that you have displayed, and I can only imagine how boring and frustrating it must be to have a progressive agenda and to be handicapped with multilingual, multinational, multi-regional bias, preference, intention, commitment, and understanding. So it's a very difficult task navigating the international agenda. But can you explain to us what your ministry has done in this past year since they have appointed a committee to determine the way forward to ban styrofoam? There's been no public disclosure, and more than 12 months have passed. And while the population languishes in accelerated breast and every type of cancer, and every type of impact that one could have from BPA and the multiple exposures, we have well-paid ministries and professionals in agencies and ministries that appear to say nothing. So my question is, what is happening with that committee, and how can the public empower ministries and professionals in ministries who often step out and whose contracts are not renewed if they step out and say something progressive that may be too progressive for the existing government, minister, chairman, managing director, etc. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for ending your question with a warning. So, your questions, of course, revolve or involve issues that are beyond the lectures that I gave. But I will certainly try to, as far as I can, and that I know, to address some of the concerns, but I understand the reasoning behind it. First, the beverage container bill. As I understand it, not as long as 3 or 4 days ago, there has been a report in the newspaper where Minister Robinson Regis has announced that the beverage container bill is back on the front burner, and there is now a concerted effort to actually bring that bill into enaction through the Parliament. And if I could maybe also echo that was also a signal this morning at the energy conference where Minister of Public Utilities also alluded to that intention. So from all intents, from what I'm hearing, the beverage container bill is back under active consideration to be brought into legislation and eventual implementation. As you would appreciate, that taking the bill to Parliament is beyond the remit of public servants. It's all ministers and politicians. That is one. I hope I answered that. That ties in specifically with the recycling aspect of it, because tied into that consideration is the issue related to recycling and how it's going to be now rolled out in light of the revival of the beverage container bill. So it's taken as a package. Yeah. Styrofoam use, plastics. The committee, I'm not involved in the committee, so I will certainly not want to speak on their behalf for fear of misrepresenting anything, because that is what I don't want to do. So your question on how you can be empowered, maybe you can write a letter to the minister or to the permanent secretary asking directly what is happening with that, and they might direct you to the persons, because I'm not on that committee. And I'm not at liberty to say what is happening, because I'd only be second guessing. And the same for single-use plastics, like straws and plastic bags and so on. But let me perhaps add my own personal touch to that. Trinidad is a land of ironies. We know that. So for example, when Massey decided, and I'm not plugging anything for Massey here, but when they decided not to, or to sell plastic bags, there was a big uproar. But the same people go to PriceSmart and they took all of their goods out on a trolley and put it in their cars. So you understand the cultural sort of mindset that you have to challenge. And therefore, how citizens can empower the government to really achieve some of the environmentally effective solutions is by empowering themselves to change their own attitudes. First and foremost, take individual responsibility, change your attitudes. But this is Trinidad is one of those countries, and people, the mindset is one of those where you have to sort of, it's a challenge in itself. But policy drives behavior, hopefully, and with the advent of the resurrection and revival of the beverage container bill, we hopefully can see, hope to see a change in attitude once this becomes implemented. Yeah.
We have time for one more question. I acknowledge you. My friend there, yes?
Good evening, everyone. Della Haripol Ganesh. With global warming and climate change being a global phenomenon, how much of an impact does it have to the effort with the US pulling out of the Paris Agreement? Because some of those countries would be, in the scale of things, the bigger polluters, and the SIDS would be the countries that would have the most effect from those.
Okay, thank you. I would invite you to read the Paris Agreement, all of you, because it's a wonderful piece of diplomatic work. if I might say so myself. But the fact is that it has engaged, or it has provisions to engage all stakeholders in every country. So it's not only a political, federal sort of government approach. In 2001, when President Bush, at that time, decided to withdraw from the Kyoto Protocol, there was concern. Because the Kyoto Protocol was the best thing since whatever you think is the best thing. And there was concern because at that time, the US was the biggest polluter, accounting for about 33%. The point is that if you had 33% of the emissions not being addressed, what was why should anyone do anything? We were all doomed. That is fundamentally different in 2015. Now the provision, Article 28 of the Paris Agreements provides that, now the US signed and ratified. Yeah, so they are ratified signatory. This happened just before the election in 2016. And the Article 28 provides that if you are a ratified party and you wish to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, you have to give notice of that formal notice to the UN of that withdrawal, and that formal notice can only become official after 3 years that you are a ratified party. The US became a ratified party, I think, on November 6th, so that they can only do that in 2016, and so they could only do that in 2019, November 5th. And the further provision is that it becomes effective and you're no longer a party 1 year after depositing your formal notice of deposition of that notice of withdrawal. So it takes you to 2020. You can do the math. My suspicion is that that 4-year period was not necessarily accidental. But let me just say quickly that the reason why there's no worry that this will happen is that the day or 2 days after Trump signaled that he was going to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, China and the EU, two of the unlikely bedfellows that you would find in international politics, came together and made a commitment that they're going to redouble their efforts to make sure that Paris is a success. It also was reflected in the states and the cities and the mayors of the United States. Just soon after, I think California announced a higher target for renewables. Orlando became the 20th, I think, city to go, intending to go totally renewable by 2050 or something like that. The point is, at the sub-state level, actions are driving climate action in the US and not necessarily at the federal level. So that there is less worry about President Trump's indication. Yeah.
I acknowledge my friend here, yes?
I just had one last question. You've talked about climate change, you've talked about the loss of food sources, possible loss of food sources, possible loss of land, effects with increased hurricane activity. I mean, how terrible are we talking here? Is there a possibility maybe 100 years, 200 years from now that the TNT could become uninhabitable? How terrible can it possibly get?
Yeah. I don't mean to be the bearer of bad news or be a doomsayer or soothsayer, as in Julius Caesar, but beware the ides of climate change. Because you don't have to wait 100 years. It happened last year to Barbuda. It happened to Dominica. We are contrary to popular opinion, we are not out or south of the hurricane belt. We are the southern edge. We got hit by Brett last year. Brett didn't come over the African coast with ample warning of 3 or 4 days that we had time to prepare. It formed just outside Trinidad and Tobago, and we only had about 48 hours. That could have developed into something major if there was warmer water. The same thing happened to the same Brett in 1993, if you don't look that old. But the same thing happened. It formed right in almost the same place. So you don't have to wait for 100 years. When Hurricane Ivan hit Grenada, and the same thing happened with Dominica, they woke up with an economy. 6 hours later, they had none. None. The GDP was totally wiped out. There was nothing to earn foreign exchange with. Nothing. Same thing happened to Barbuda. The same thing happened to Dominica. They are now rebuilding. Grenada is now coming out of the doldrums of those impacts. So you don't have to wait for 100 years. It can happen at any time. And these effects are exacerbated by warming oceans. And the anomalous warming of the Pacific, called the Southern Oscillation anomaly, El Nino and La Nina, also affects the Caribbean, although it happens in the Pacific. So in years of La Nina, when there's an anomalous cooling, expect more storms. So it's not 100 years at all. It could be at any time.
Final question for Mr. Abood.
So Kumarsingh, I would stay here all night and listen to you because I just want to understand. So 100 years ago, the degradation and the discharge and the human impact will have an effect on us now. That's fair to say. But 100 years ago, the industrial and production and energy-based capacity of the planet was probably at about maybe 10 or 20% of what it is now. So I just wanted to underscore your answer for the questioner that what we will see, based on what you are saying, is a substantial change compared to what we have already seen. So I would like to say to her that yes, I think we will be a wasteland, but that's not my question. My question really was just to underscore what you had said about the beverage containers bill. Perhaps at that time, I'm putting in perhaps, that the incentives for recycling would be there. But what I was asking is that we already have a vibrant recycling sector now, many of whom I am familiar with, I've served on, and have never been approved or granted any concessions. I was just saying that while the Parliament may continue for another 20 years to bring the beverage containers bill every time before an election to show good faith, perhaps it would be a good idea now to put in some incentives, tax holidays, etc., for people to invest in and integrate. So when, if the beverage or some form of something is introduced, we would already have had an industry that had pioneer status and would have invested. That was what I was trying to say, but I appreciate you allowing me to. But the question is, I wanted to ask you if you've ever experienced the frustration of long negotiations and successful commitments on an international level that is not supported by legislation locally, or if there's legislation locally, it's unenforced, or if there's an international obligation, if you have found it frustrating that at the end of every convention, there is an option for the local agency or government to interpret or enforce based on local conditions. What I mean is, are you frustrated to be writing and preparing and negotiating submissions and commitments that are not supported at home?
Let me address your comment. I think your comment before the question is an excellent subject matter for a letter that you can pen to the minister. Because make no mistake, we don't really have a recycling industry. We have a sorting industry in Trinidad and Tobago. We sort plastics and we store it somewhere. We don't recycle it. So I think we need to contextualize what we mean by recycling. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I was talking about plastics, but because you talked about the beverage container bill. Yes, and the answer is yes. When you can't, if you're not an optimist and an eternal one of that, don't enter into negotiations. Because you could break your heart on the first day. It's really a place not for the faint-hearted. But with each convention, every convention is unique, it has its own provisions. Only in some jurisdictions there are provisions for the international law to be directly incorporated into domestic law. It becomes binding. Only in some, I think that's in Latin America, mainly in some countries. But you still have to do the analysis, which is what we are doing now for Paris Agreement, for example. You still have to analyze the existing legal framework, the policy framework, and then make recommendations for where those gaps cannot be filled to accommodate the provisions of the agreement, which is what we are doing now, and making recommendations, with the caveat that I made before, that public servants don't go to parliament to lay bills. It is the politicians, but the most we can do is make recommendations.
Thank you, sir. It's now my pleasure to move the vote of thanks. So it's now my pleasure to move the vote of thanks on behalf of the IME in recognition of the persons that have made this event possible, but not only possible, I'm sure you'd agree with me that this evening was quite a success. Thank you. Mr. Kumarsingh explained just what climate change is, how human activity, specifically the burning of fossil fuels, contributes to the quickening of climate change and the climate change process. And he explained a little bit about the environmental, social, psychological, economic impacts of climate change, and he gave us all some mitigation strategies. At this point, I want to invite Dr. Rehana Juman to offer some token and congratulations to Mr. Kumarsingh on our behalf. Thank you, Dr. Juman. And I know time has left us, but it would be remiss of me if I didn't thank our organizers, Lauren Barrow and Tracy Medina, and their able and very, very willing supporters, Ms. Christine Thomas Dookie, Mr. Rene Peters, who's responsible for audio and visual, Mr. Mark Pear, Ms. Jennifer Alexander, Mr. Gisha Charles, Ms. Dawn Caesar, Ms. Rhonda Joseph, and Mrs. Maria Wyke. Our digital media specialist, Carl Doyle and Janice Mohan, and our information officers, Crystal Ganishlalal and Glendon Glasgow. Of course, there would be no event unless you were here. So thank you for coming out. Thank you for accepting our invitation to be here. Most importantly, though, I'm asking you to share the information that you receive here this afternoon. Like our page on Facebook. Snippets of, or maybe the whole video will upload to YouTube. So subscribe to our YouTube channel. And as you leave, just before you leave, there is a little book that we published for our 40th anniversary. It's a field reference guide as you walk along the seashore, July, August vacation with your families. There's a book. If you find things on the seashore, you can discuss with your children just what they are, the local name, the scientific name, and so help in that education process of preserving and conserving our environment, and especially our marine environment. Also, if you would bear with us, we also would like some feedback from you with regard to how you received our lecture, what else we can do. So Lorraine and the others will give you, you can either do it hard copy, pen and paper, or we have some cute computers on the back you can answer online. So Lorraine and Crystal, Carl, if you can hand out the feedback forms. So, ladies and gentlemen, stay with us a while. We've come to the end of it all, but we have some refreshments at the back, some tea, some coffee, some juice. Talk about it a while. I'm sure you could ask Mr. Kumarsingh anything that you haven't gotten a chance to ask because our time is short. And thank you again for coming out. We've come to the end of our evening. Good day.